Hello, everybody. If it's your first time with us today, welcome. And if you've been here with us before, welcome back. We're taking a look today at beginner strategy, kicking off our series on that. And what we're going to look at are opening principles. So, how can you play to get the advantage in the opening? What ideas should you have in mind in order to get the better of your opponent and keep from the opponent having the upper hand, making sure we're getting nice, fun positions to play. Today we're going to be taking a look at a game that I played on chess.com that's going to help to illustrate some of these points that we're talking about. The first main thing that we want to mention here is that in the opening, a lot of our battle is going to want to center around, well, the middle of the board, the center of the board. These four squares in the middle, and more peripherally, the ones around the outer edge here, that's our center of the board. That's where we want to try to be moving our pieces toward. When we learned how the pieces moved, we found out that bishops, knights, queens all gain more strength from being in the center of the board, so we want to make sure that that's where the main battle is going on. So this game's going to kick off with the move e4, a nice central pawn move, opening up lines for our bishops, taking space in the center of the board, as we just mentioned. For white, any pawn moves really are okay, but these three here in the center are the most common, right? e4, d4, and c4 are the most common openings for that exact reason. All of them help to fight for the middle and make some space for our pieces. My opponent played e5, a nice principled response, a fairly common opening that you'll see here. e4 and e5 leads to a lot of very rich lines that we can have in our chess game. Knight f3 comes next. Now, another thing to think about is after we're fighting for the center, we want to make sure we develop our pieces, right? So our plan should be to make space, get our knights into the game, fight for the center, get our bishops involved as well, and try to make sure our pieces are prepared to help in the battle. When we're developing our pieces, a typical rule is that we like to bring our knights out before our bishops. Why is that? Why would I play the move knight f3 here? What would be wrong with a move like bishop c4, for example? Well, nothing is inherently wrong with this move, but when we bring our bishops out early, the problem is that they can become targets. So black could potentially play the move c6 here, with the idea of next turn playing d5 and attacking my bishop. This c6 move does help to control one of those four center squares, and it prepares another central push so that black can get even greater control in the middle. So typically we like to bring our knights out before our bishops. That way we're not making them targets early on, and we can kind of see what our opponent does to figure out where the best square to put our bishop will be. So my opponent plays knight to c6, I'm attacking a pawn, and he's defending that pawn. And now I can play bishop c4. What's the big difference here? Well, this knight coming to c6 means black can't play that line. He can't go c6 and c5 because now there's a knight there. So he could come up with other ways to attack me. He could maybe play a6 and b5, but that would be attacking outside of the center, so it's not such a big concern for me. It's not the end of the world to have that happen. We're moving toward the center, and we're developing our pieces. So how can we continue with that? Bishop e7 is what my opponent plays next. Now, this move is a little bit against what we've been talking about. Bishop e7 is not helping in the fight for the center. It does develop a piece, but it's a fairly passive square, so if I were rating this move, I'd say, this is maybe a small opening in accuracy from my opponent. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, but it's a little passive. He's not fighting for anything. When we develop our pieces, we want to move them to active squares. What do I mean by active squares? Well, my knight on f3 here is attacking the pawn on e5. My bishop on c4 is attacking the pawn on f7. Active squares eye the opponent's pieces and give us options for attack. The bishop on e7, it doesn't attack anywhere. It maybe prevents our knight from coming to a couple squares, but that's really about it. So let's continue with our own ideas here as white. Next thing that white did here was I decided to castle. Now, not all of my pieces are developed yet. We could have continued with our developing plan, played a move like d3 or knight to c3. But another thing that we want to think about in the opening, aside from the center and aside from developing, is king safety. And if we leave our king in the center of the board, where a lot of the play is likely to be happening, then potentially we could come under attack. If these pawns start coming forward, moves like d4 or d5, and then there's some trades, maybe queens and rooks are on these lines, and you can see that after something, like rook e1 and pawns opening up, the queens have these files, all these pieces start fighting in the center, and that can be a really dangerous place for your king to be. You don't want all of these pieces swarming around it. So castling is a nice way to get your king out of the center where the main fight is going on and make sure that king is safe. Right, my opponent played knight f6, a developing move and active, good idea, and I played knight to c3, defending my e4 pawn, bringing my knight into the game. My opponent plays d6, another good move. He's making space for his bishop to come into the game, and here I decided to play a little move that is what we consider prophylactic. So what we're thinking about is, what is my opponent's idea here? My opponent played d6, and he's making space for his bishop. He wants to develop it somewhere along this diagonal. Which squares could he develop it to? Well, he could go to any one of those highlighted squares. The one that I don't want him to come to, really, is g4. It'd be kind of annoying to have this bishop on g4. That bishop would pin my knight to my queen, and then my knight couldn't move. So even though this h3 move is not fighting for the center, the idea is that we're going to make one move here to prevent my opponent's idea, and then get back to our plan. That knight pin could be really annoying, especially since I've already played this knight to c3, rather than d2. It can't help in supporting my other knight. So we're just making sure that we don't get into any trouble. We're limiting the activity of our opponent. My opponent castled, king safety, right? So we're both keeping to those opening principles pretty well so far. And now I decided to play d4. Once again, fight for the center. I've got my pawn on e4, and now my pawn's coming to d4 as well, and I'm creating space for my bishop to come into the game. Black plays a6. And once again, anytime our opponent makes a move, in addition to thinking about our own plans, we always need to ask ourselves, what's my opponent's idea here? Well, a6 gets a little bit of control over the b5 square. Now, my knight and my bishop have already developed, so black shouldn't be very concerned with me playing a move like knight b5 or bishop b5. He's got to have another idea here. Why would he want to control this b5 square? Well, black potentially might want to play the move b7 to b5 and attack my bishop. In fact, if he plays b7, b5, and my bishop moves, he could then play b5 to b4, and my knight would have to move. And my knight right now is doing a very important job, right? Remember, my knight's guarding the e4 pawn, so if he plays b5, b4, my knight moves, suddenly he has ideas of capturing this pawn. He's setting up a little trap here in the opening for me to fall into. So how do I handle this? a4. Back to that idea of prophylactic play, right? We played h3 earlier in order to prevent bishop to g4, and now we played a4 to prevent b5. If he plays b5, a takes b5, and after a takes b5, we can simply take the pawn with the bishop, and happy days for white. We'll be up a pawn. So even though right now our goal's playing in the center, developing our pieces, I'd love to move my bishop out, bring it into the game, the c1 bishop. Always take a moment, think about what your opponent's ideas are, and make sure we respond to those accordingly as well. Next, my opponent played bishop d7. Kind of like bishop e7, I think this is a little bit passive. I don't know that this is the best move here. The bishop would be better on a square like e6. I understand that my opponent is worried about this trade of bishops. He doesn't want to trade them off yet, so he's trying to develop to a different square, but maybe there's a better way for black to do this. Maybe he could prepare this plan. Already you can see, look at how many active pieces white has. This knight and this bishop are nice. This knight is ready to come into the game to do things. This pawn's attacking. Once it opens up, our queen is active. And for black, well, this knight's hitting d4, this knight's hitting e4, but these bishops are doing nothing, and this bishop, especially on d7, is even blocking in his queen. So black's already becoming less active. So, what do we want to do when our opponent is less active? We'll keep bringing our pieces into the battle, keep putting ourselves into a spot to be ready to attack. So I go ahead and bring my bishop to e3. This is making space, once again working toward the center so that if these pawns come off, there will be more space for the bishop. And another thing to note here is that he can't play knight g4 to attack the bishop either, because we already got in this move h3, so we're not worried about the bishop coming under attack. Alrighty, black here played h6, and once again this is a little bit of a passive move. When he played a6, it seemed to be preparing b5. He could be preparing the idea of g5 here, but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of threat to that right now. His king's already castled kingside, and this would weaken the squares around the black king considerably, especially considering that his pieces aren't in the best places in the world. So h6 is probably not the best idea for black. He could have played that on the last move before bishop e7 if he was worried about me playing bishop g5. But now I've already developed my bishop e3, I'm probably not going to make two moves with a piece to bring it to g5. That's another rule of our opening. If we can, we want to avoid moving the same piece more than once. Why is that? Why do we not want to move the same piece multiple times? Well, remember, we want to develop our pieces as quick as possible. So when we make more than one move with the same piece, we're not giving our other pieces a chance to get into the game. So after h6, we play the move queen to d2. So, we talked about controlling the center, bringing our knights out before those bishops, developing our pieces, put things on active squares, get the king to safety, and the last thing that's always a fun little thing to do that'll help us out is think about what we call connecting the rooks. You'll notice here, all of the squares are empty now between white's two rooks. Rooks move on the sides and the vertical axes. They like space, right? So the more space they have, the more mobile, the more chance they'll have to come into the game. And once these files start to open up, when pawns start being traded off, then we can figure out, hey, where's the rook best going to be placed? Where can it be a happy rook that'll help us in the battle to come? So, the last little thing to add in there with the opening, fighting for the center, getting our knights out, developing our pieces, stay active, keep the king safe, and develop the rooks. Let's go ahead and see how this game finished up here just for fun. This, I would say, is about toward the end of the opening at this point. Those are our main principles. That's what we want to focus on. And now let's see how those principles can turn into something really good for us. So what happened in this game? Well, black played king to h7, which is moving away from this pin, right? The bishop is pinning the pawn to the king, so he's getting out of that. Maybe he wants to eventually push his pawn to f5, but it's going to take some time. He'll have to move the knight first. So for the time being, this move king h7 isn't doing all too much. Let's go ahead, centralize our rooks. Still an opening idea, now bringing our last pieces into the game. And black decided to start opening things up a bit. He played e takes d4. Now, an important thing to think about is, when do we want to trade pieces? We'll talk about that more in some other videos, but we want to trade pieces when we have a disadvantage in space, right? Black's position is a little cramped, so maybe he wants to trade some pieces to open up some space for himself. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop takes d4. He's trading up, opening up some space. That way he can play bishop c6. But now, look at how white is controlling the center. All of these squares being attacked by the bishop, the knight's attacking, the pawn. White has a very nice central space advantage, and we can increase that even further. Here we played queen d3. Now, what's the idea behind queen d3? Two things. The first is that black is threatening my e5 pawn, so we're now defending it twice from the queen and the knight. And the second is that now we've got our queen in line with black's king here, so we're setting up some threats. Maybe we're going to play the move e5 at some point, with check, attacking the king, and attacking the knight at the same time, so black has to be very careful about what's going on here. Black put his king back to g8 to get out of the threat, and now this makes black's earlier move of king h7 seem very silly. He moved his king to h7, and then he moved it back to g8. That wasted two moves. In general, if our opponent is just wasting moves, we want to find a way to act quickly and try to punish it, gain an advantage. How's white going to do that? f4 here, taking more space, and now you can see how the pieces are all starting to aim toward black's king. The bishop's on these pretty diagonals, the rook is ready to come into the game, and because of our opening principles, the way that we played with nice, sound, simple moves early on, our pieces are ready to become attacking pieces, to be able to take over the game. Black played knight to d7. He's worried about e5 attacking his knight. I don't know that this is really the best move, but let's see how to keep going with this. How can we try to punish black? Queen to g3. Well, we're creating a simple threat. Queen takes g7 would be checkmate. Black doesn't want that. And we're also moving our queen just to a place where it's going to help more actively. Before it had the idea of attacking the king on this diagonal, the king's not on that diagonal anymore, so let's move to where we're in line with him. Let's start giving ourselves some attacking chances. Bishop to f6. He's got to defend against the mating threat. And what can white play to take advantage of this position? How can we try to start hoisting things apart? e5. And now we start getting to some very big tactical moments in this game. It looks like black should be able to take enough times in order to hold the square, right? We have 1, 2, 3 defenders here, and black has 1, 2, only 3 defenders. So if he captures, we can capture, and suddenly it's not enough times. How do we know if a square is defended or attacked enough to be able to take? Well, we can count the pieces controlling it. Black has 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking e5. White has 1, 2, 3 pieces defending e5. White is going to keep control of the square. So after e5, d takes e5, f takes e5, and this might be a slight mistake from black as well. By trading the pawns, now our rook is on an open file. This rook is on an open file in line with the queen, and things are looking very, very dangerous. The bishop comes to h4. He's trying to attack my queen, trying to create a little bit of a tempo gain there. And the next move I played with white is a very pretty move here. Maybe not objectively the best in the position, but creates some very wonderful threats. And one thing you'll note here is our bishop on c4 pins the king. This pawn on f7 cannot move. Right now our rook is attacking it. I would love to bring another piece to attack it. How can I do that? His bishop's defending this square, his bishop's defending this square. I could play queen to f4, but then my queen's in front of my rook. So let's find something even more explosive. Queen to g6. Ooh, what a pretty looking move, right? Moving the queen where it looks like it can be taken by the pawn, but of course it can't be taken by the pawn because the bishop pins it. Now black has to do something to defend. queen to e7, and we can start ripping things open. White's ready to come in, find the crushing blow for the attack. How can he do that here? Rook takes f7. Wow, right? This looks like it's a sacrifice. It looks like suddenly black is defending this square 3 times. White's only defending it twice. And, well, white's losing a piece here, isn't he? Well, let's see what happens. How can we finish off our attack? Rook takes f7. And now the key move, e6. Forking the rook and the knight. And the point is that if the rook moves, we can capture this knight, and then that capture will happen with check, and we'll be able to get another piece as well, or continue with our attack. So if, for example, black plays rook to f6, which is probably his best defense, white can play e takes d7 with check. The rook can't come back because then it's in the pin of the bishop. We can take it. If his king moves, we can take the rook on f6. We're going to get our material back and have an advantage going forward. Unfortunately, my opponent did not play rook f6. He played a slightly worse move, which is rook to f8 here, and this move is going to lose on the spot. How can white really punish the move rook to f8? What's our big attack here? Well, we already mentioned e takes d7 with check, and now black resigned. Why is that? Why did black resign from this position? Well, black has only a couple of options to get out of check here. If he blocks with the bishop, we just take it, it's still check. If he blocks with the queen, then our bishop can take the queen. That would not be very good for him. So what about with the rook? Well, if he plays rook f7, what's the mate in 1 here for white? It's a very pretty mate in 1. See if you can find it. We're going to use advantage of this pin of the bishop. So how do we take advantage of that? Queen takes g7, checkmate. The rook wants to capture the queen, but he can't because he's pinned to the king. Our bishop protects the queen, and that would be checkmate. So he can't play rook to f7. So there's only one other move, right? King to h8. Now, how do we give checkmate with king to h8? We took advantage of the pin of the bishop on the last time. Well, he's not really pinning. He's protecting the g8 square now. But now we can take advantage of another pin. This bishop pins the g-pawn to the king, and we can play queen takes h6, checkmate. And wow, what a pretty mate it is. 2 pins of the bishops working together there, and white is able to finish it off. Happy days, a nice win. How did we get that win? We stuck to those opening principles. All of these moves, all of the position of our pieces came from those things we talked about. Attack in the center, develop our pieces, bring them to active squares, keep your own king safe, get those rooks connected, and then start looking for ways to create problems with your opponent. You'll have a nice opening and a good game to play ahead of you. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. I hope that you all have enjoyed this video, and I hope that you'll be able to use these opening principles, opening theories, in order to give yourselves some beautiful positions and some nice, happy wins. Best of luck.